Welcome to the Low-Carb MD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor. Welcome to the Low Carb MD podcast. Guys, you are in for a treat. If you don't know who Dr. Andreas Eenfeldt is, you probably have been living under a rock for about 15 years. He is the CEO of Diet Doctor, and before he was the CEO of Diet Doctor, he was a family doc in Sweden, seeing thousands of patients, and he saw the benefit of low-carb diets in his patients. And he found that there was nowhere for his patients and people in general to go. So he founded Diet Doctor. And now Diet Doctor must be the most visited site on the internet about low carb and ketogenic diets. Probably over 300,000 people a day go to Diet Doctor. He's also on the board of the Dietary Science Foundation, and an all-around great guy. Tall as hell. Tall as hell. If you ever met him, you definitely have to look up. Dr. Andreas, nice to have you here.
Well, thank you, Tro. That's a very nice introduction. Thank you for that, and pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so I think let's start. Some people may not know, and I think you're a bit camera shy, right? So some people may not know the passion behind why you started Diet Doctor, how you got into the space. They may see some controversy now about satiety-per-calorie, which I hope we can talk about.
Yeah, great.
But let's go back, and you're a new doctor practicing, you see obesity and diabetes flourishing. How do you go from that to, owning and operating the biggest website on low carb and ketogenic diets?
Oh yeah, it's been an exciting journey for sure. Lots of exciting roller coaster moments, and certainly wasn't my goal to build contribute to building a big company or anything. So I got really into it 21 years ago. I just started reading some book about nutrition, and was just out of med school, and I found it absolutely fascinating because like any medical people watching this, that we don't get much nutrition training in med school. Maybe it's like a week or something, and we get told to avoid saturated fat and count your calories and whatever everybody else is taught. But this book was about a low glycemic index diet, and talked about hormones and insulin and blood sugar, and all these things we think about when we go low carb and explore that. And it's just all made so much sense to me. So I became really into this and started reading lots of books, a lot of scientific studies, talking to lots of people. And I guess similar to you, I suppose, and everybody else in this field, I just got extremely passionate about this because, as we all know, poor metabolic health is such a huge disaster around the world. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, etc., drives all our top chronic diseases, heart disease, cancer, and so forth, and poor quality of life. And people don't get good support for this within the healthcare system. Still the same thing now as 20 years ago when I got into it, is that we think of medications and procedures, etc., and whatever effort gets into lifestyle is very low, and maybe somewhat misguided and not so helpful. So that's how I got into it. Super passionate about that, and just started trying to guide patients to better food, better lifestyles for them. They got some amazing results. That's what really convinced me. Like, I was a young doctor, relatively new, and my patients got results that when I showed it to my older peers, they were like, they'd never seen anything like it. Blood glucose going from super high to normal or borderline normal in weeks or months. It's like that they had never seen anything like it. Of course, neither had I, but it's like I feel like I stumbled upon some sort of holy grail there of sort of, here's how we can really help people beyond just setting them up with medications for life. So yeah, I just got very passionate about how can you do this, not just for one patient at a time, right? But for many, many more people. And the internet was, of course, there, and blogs were sort of popular. So I started a blog, and that's where it all started snowballing until, yeah, like you said, Diet Doctor is most likely the most visited and perhaps most trusted resource for low carb and keto online, with hundreds of thousands of people visiting daily, and lots of people using our services. So that's amazing. Of course, now it's not just me. We have a huge team compared to when I got started. It was just me and my brother helped me set up the website. So yeah, exciting times, never boring.
A couple of interesting things. I've always thought this about the medical field. I'm sure I suffered from severe class 3 obesity, sleep apnea, hypertension, and the mantra all throughout my training, medical school and residency, was the best diet is the diet you can adhere to. Like, this is the common mantra in lifestyle medicine right now. If you look at the average sort of doctor, well, whatever you can stick to. Right? Count your calories, eat less, be in a caloric deficit, whatever you can stick to. And it hit me, when will our profession do what you've done, which is take the next step and say, how can we make people adhere better? How can we make it easy for them? And I think that that's a huge step that people don't value, or don't value enough. Right? Diet Doctor,
Absolutely,
from my standpoint, is the execution of somebody who said, I need to make this easier for somebody else. Right? I need to make this easier for somebody else. And so it strikes me how precious that philosophy is, because our colleagues in medicine don't do it. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I 100% agree with you, Tro. We're totally aligned there. Simplicity and trustworthiness have been guiding principles for us for decades when we created this. I mean, 15 years building this resource, first in Swedish and then in English. So it's so complicated, right? For people to change their lifestyle and know what to eat. There's so many different messages out there. And like you said, often what people get told is just count your calories, eat less. And pretty much every expert know that fails for most people. Yeah. And I would say the reason why it fails so badly is that what we eat is ultimately what's going to determine in the long term how much we want to eat. And that's, I think, why low carb and keto works so well for so many people, is because if you eat lower carb or a ketogenic diet, then you tend to want to eat less. And you're still satiated, and you're not hungry, and you don't have to count your calories anymore, because if you're not hungry, you don't want to eat more, then there's no need to do it, right? So I think that's yeah. But back to what you said, simplicity. Yeah, I think it's absolutely key, and trustworthiness, in the sense that for things to be simple, you have to be able to trust the information. You have to be able to trust that it's scientifically accurate and that it works, right? And then you don't have to. Then you can just go and do it. And if the instruction is simple and the program is simple, then you stand a chance to actually succeed, I think.
Yeah, I've taken it a step further. In my own business, it's how can we engage? How can we, create bonds between people on their journeys, which I think is so critical. Now, so I want to still go back, right? you're a young doctor, you're setting this up, you're finding success, you're doing it in Swedish, and then you're changing it to English. And what was the most convincing evidence for you? I mean, clearly it was your patients responding had an impact on you. I see that, right? Like you're like, okay, people, and then once you have a website that's gaining traction, I'm guessing you're going to get pictures. I mean, we've seen all the pictures, on Diet Doctor of before and afters. So you're getting all of this sort of anecdotal information about how successful this is. But what scientific data convinced you that, okay, low carb is a viable option compared to, low fat, which is probably, or calorie counting or Weight Watchers? What was like the data that, the scientific literature that sort of said, okay, there's something here, there's something more here?
Excellent question, because well, as you know, you can find fantastic success stories on many approaches. So while it's very convincing on a personal level to have your own results, you can see the results on yourself, and you can see the results on your patients. You can see the black and white on their lab tests and everything. That is very personally convincing, I think, for a human to be close to people who succeed. But that said, there is another level of scientific evidence that as a medical doctor, you start looking for that. Is it really a more effective option than other effective options, right? And that's also a big part of what convinced me, is that there are numerous, actually dozens of randomized controlled trials, like the gold standard research, showing that on a low-carb diet, people tend to lose more weight, improve their metabolic health more than, let's say, a low-fat diet. So while all these approaches, or many approaches, can work, it tends to be that low-carb is more effective for metabolic health, for body composition, weight loss. So that's absolutely a huge part of what convinced me as well.
So, there was a shift in the data, in my opinion, probably from the inception of diet trials all the way to about 2010, 2015. Most of the head-to-head trials were favorable for low carb, not by much. We're talking about maybe 2 pounds, 3 pounds. I mean, I'm talking about 3-month trials, 6-month trials, and even some of the longer term trials, A to Z, the SHI study, stuff like that. They had been historically, it was Atkins or Sornish, or, low carb versus low fat. And historically, the low carb had done better. But then things started to change after Nusi, right? After Nusi, things started to change. All of a sudden, the trial design started to change, and it wasn't. And so,
ironic,
right?
Because if the listeners don't know what Nusi is, the Nutrition Science Initiative was actually an initiative, a nonprofit set up to prove, in a way, that low carb is superior.
So, and what I found interesting was, they went to brilliant scientists like Kevin Hall and Gardner, and who are experts in trial design. I mean, really, just they're brilliant people. I've talked to them both in person, on and elsewhere. So, but things changed. Did those studies, the DIETFITS study, the animal-based low-carb study versus low-fat, did those sort of test your confidence in low-carb? I know a lot of smart people have had their confidence in the data tested by these two big trials.
Yeah, definitely. I think they are highly insightful studies that we can learn a lot from. And I think that, the initial impulse, sort of, let's say back in 2017, 18, or something like that, was that, we know that low carb is great. These studies are sort of anomalies, and try to find why they were not showing what we thought they would show. Like the DIETFITS study, for people who are not familiar with it, tested a low-carb diet versus a low-fat diet, but healthy versions of it. So both were low in processed foods, both were low in sugar, etc. And they were both effective, but they were equally effective. So you have basically a low-carb diet and a high-carb diet that are both effective. Both groups lost 7-8 kilos or something, which is for a diet trial pretty good. But there was no clear difference. So I think that really really challenges this idea that it is carbs and any carbs that is the main problem for obesity.
Yeah, I have a personal issue with the author who wrote that, because if you sort of, which is Gardner, the lead author on that study, and I've written letters to the editor on his which were published about some of his work, because I look at A to Z, which was just straight up low carb versus low. A to Z was a bunch of different diets, very unbiased, sort of a standard sort of approach. Then, in DIETFITS, it took a step further to sort of equalize the arms. He told both arms, drop your sugar, drop your flour, eat real food, right? And
I think that's super interesting interesting study.
I mean, which is basically lowering the glycemic index of both diets. And, 3 and 6 months, there was better weight loss, but at 12 months, it sort of equalized. The other part of his message in that trial, which was different from A to Z, was just do what you can tolerate. If, increase your carbs until you're happy, and increase your fat until you're happy in the low fat arm. So I found that to be a different than the model you and I employ, which is let's help our patients adhere for as long as possible.
Yeah.
Right?
I think I don't think it's necessarily all that helpful to say eat whatever you can.
Well, it wasn't eat
enjoy,
whatever, but it was like increase your carbohydrates if you need to, and increase your fat if you need to, which I found to be, so at the end of 12 months, the results equalized. What confirmed my suspicion of his brilliance in trial design was when Gardner did the Keto Med study. And what he did in Keto Med, he compared a ketogenic diet to a Mediterranean diet. And we did a journal club on this podcast. And what he said was, stop all your sulfonylureas on the ketogenic arm and don't stop them on the Mediterranean arm. And the end point was A1C, right, for that study. And if you look at the publication, the conclusion was there's no difference between diets. And it confirmed my suspicion that, hey, wait a second, some of these PIs are just very amazing at trial design. And so my confidence was never shooken. What do you, and there's been reanalysis of DIETFITS. There's people sort of looking into Kevin Hall's, short-term study, also had some interesting findings. There's been some criticism of those studies. What do you, and namely from me, let's put it that way, but also from, Adrian Sotomoda and Nick Norwitz and David Ludwig, and
I'm well aware of that.
Yeah. So what do you think?
And I mean, I was the same way. I would say when it came out, like I wanted to find why is it not showing what I expected it to find. But I would argue that we can learn interesting things from this study that may actually be valuable, because remember, the low carb arm really worked. People lost a lot of weight from compared to other diet studies. It's actually a good outcome, right? So when we're talking about that there was no difference, I think a key message gets lost, which is that the low carb arm did really, really well, right? So when we are giving advice to people to eat low carb or keto, that has good support in this study, because the results were, overall excellent when compared to other dietary studies. The other interesting thing is, though, that you could get similar results by eating a high carb diet as long as it's low in refined carbs, sugar, processed carbs, right?
So what I'm hearing is there are more than one mechanism at play here. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
it's
like there's more than one way to Rome, right?
well,
As they say, you can get your you can improve your metabolic health in many ways, and we know this from just the real kind of world experience as well, that there are people, there are societies, and there are groups of people who are extremely healthy and extremely lean, eating higher carb diets, as long as it's no processed foods, just very natural. I mean, you talk about people that have been investigated, the Hadza people, the Gitavans, traditional Asian societies eating quite a lot of rice heavy diet. I mean, before 100 years ago or 50 years ago, before modern processed foods, right? Before sugar and processed foods, they virtually had no obesity whatsoever, and they had no metabolic syndrome. Yet they were on a higher carb diet, and same for Hadza, same for Gitava. There are groups of fitness people today eating a relatively high carb diet and being super ripped and shredded. They no obesity whatsoever. There are all these groups, right? And I think what it shows is that there isn't just one way to reach your goals, and that is fascinating to me. Like, how can we define what is it then? Because obviously the modern processed food that is all around us is a disaster. We know now that 93% of the adult US population has poor metabolic health. If you go to people who are 50 and above, I got to that level, it's 3%. 3% are normal. 97% are unhealthy in the population. Like, these are insane numbers. And what's fascinating to me is, can we define what the actual problem is here? We know that as a group, ultra-processed foods are a problem, but we can't really say why. We know that low-carb or ketogenic diets work really well. You exclude all these ultra-processed foods, pretty much 90% of them are gone, right? 95 perhaps. And then you get away from this problem. But you can get away from it in other ways too. So that's what I'm fascinated about now. Like, low-carb, great, it works, proven, evidence-based. But are there other ways that can help more people?
Do you think that so I like to think about, okay, let's go back to mechanisms, because I think what you're hinting at is, hey, wait a second, low carb did well, and you know what, even if Gardner is a brilliant trial designist, and so is Kevin Hall, they're just brilliant, and
yeah, very smart people,
and maybe they put designed it in a way to just tip it in the favor of equality, or but let's just take it aside.
Maybe, but keep in mind, Nusi financed some of these studies, right? You always talk about how the financer.
Don't give me an aneurysm, because the amount of money that went into that, I think it, in retrospect, it really set back some research in the field.
I don't know. I mean, I think here is where we might disagree. I think you can learn a lot. We can learn a lot from these studies. They are very interesting.
But we're only at the tip of the iceberg. So, and the reason why I say that is, we have an IRB now through Stanford, where we're analyzing sort of big data sets of patients from metabolic clinics. And so I have inside information. We see the data, right? So, and so I know there's a lot to be studied, but I think, pragmatically speaking, they were brilliant, and but what it did for the low carb community was, I think, set back further research. Right? These are huge, these were huge nails in the coffins. But I think there's more to come. But the question I have for you is when you look at our population, and I like to think about mechanisms, right? If a low carbohydrates approach, the mechanisms which it may work, if we were to suppose, you and I, right? It normalizes blood sugars, it improves sort of your triglyceride levels, maybe affects leptin resistance, it brings down A1C. And if we could suppose a low fat diet, what it does is it increases the volume of the food, right? It maybe makes the food slightly more bland or not as tasty because there's not as much fat, especially if you're removed the processed carbs. And if you removed the sugar, right, it would be a fairly, bland diet. I'm not to say that it can't be made more tasty, but just so maybe there's a palatability component, a volume component to low fat diets, right? That maybe that's how.
Absolutely.
And those are both in relation to the addictive food environment we're in, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly.
So help me understand. So we have these mechanisms. Okay. Now, as our population gets more metabolically unwell, and as our population gets more pre-diabetic, diabetic, right? Don't these mechanisms become even more important? Like, doesn't it become even more important that the diet that can normalize blood sugar, right? As we get more and more problems of higher blood sugar, doesn't it become, in my mind, it says a low carbohydrate diet is actually going to become more and more favorable as time goes on. Whereas historically, if you went back, if you got me 50 years ago and you said, here's the population, right? Which diet will do better? I may have said, I don't know. But now when I look at the population, I'm like, wait a second. You said 97% are metabolically unwell. Well, we know in head trials
from people over 50, yeah.
So in my mind, I think we're 20 years ahead of our time. I know the Google searches we're like 3 years after our time or 4 years after our time for now.
Yeah.
But I think we're 20 years ahead of our time. What do you think about that idea based on those mechanisms you were talking about, the benefit of each diet?
Yeah. No, I'm fascinated by this now. Exactly what you're talking about. What are the underlying mechanisms? Because we know low carb works, but we know a high carb diet can also work. So what the hell is going on there? And I think it's exactly what you said and some other factors. Energy density is certainly one factor that can make a diet more effective for weight loss and body composition, meaning foods that are less processed, less concentrated energy, and more natural in a sense. Vegetables, of course, but also
like
animal foods
would be like my protein chips, right? They're very energy dense versus like chicken breast, which probably have the same macros or close. Right, which has a lot more sort of volume, food matrix. Is that what you mean by energy density?
Yeah, and it's often ultra-processed foods that are very energy dense, ice cream or donuts or potato chips, like you said, or French fries, very energy dense, meaning that there's a lot of energy in every...
I said protein chips.
100 grams.
I did not say potato chips.
Protein chips.
Potato chips
protein chips, exactly.
Are a 15-letter word we don't use,
Okay, yeah, sure. But so that's just one factor, but it seems to be impactful. Another factor seems to be protein, a protein percentage. I think that it's very uncontroversial even today to say that protein is the most satiating macronutrient. I mean, most nutritionists, I think, would agree. And it's fascinating to me to look at all these low-carb studies that show that low-carb tends to be more effective. They all are higher in protein. The one you show, the A to Z study, the Gardner study, which is one of the ones I really was looking at back when I was getting started, 2006. The Atkins arm, the low carb arm, was way above in protein. So you take away the carbs, you tend to eat more protein instead, and that may be one of the key factors why a low carb diet works. But a low-fat diet also can be higher in protein, actually. You remove the fat, now you eat more protein instead of that. And then what you just talked about, the hyper-palatable foods, the highly rewarding foods, the foods that we just can't stop eating, the Doritos of this world, the Häagen-Dazs ice cream, just impossible to stop, right? That tends to be carb and fat together, sugar and fat together. That's the most potent combination probably. And if you go low carb or keto, all of that is gone, right? You are not going to be able to eat pretty much any of that food if you want to keep your carbs below 20 grams a day. The same is true on a low-fat diet. So why can a low-carb and a low-fat diet both work? Well, that's probably one of the factors. They both exclude all these ultra-processed, highly energy-dense, highly palatable, low-protein foods, right? So now we have multiple factors here.
And even more, I'm thinking out loud, even more. If I'm having my meal, I'll just tell you within my life, and maybe you make sense of this for me. If I'm eating a meal, I certainly don't want to be low in fat. I want it to have moderate fat. I want, if I eat plain tuna, I'm not going to eat a lot and I'm going to be hungry very soon. So when I'm eating a meal and when I'm eating to sort of nourish my body and I want to be full for a long time, I want some fat.
Yeah. When
I'm snacking, when my mouth just wants to eat, like late at night, I want something to eat. If my choice is nuts and cheese versus celery and peppers, I would choose celery and peppers, right? So I think, does this mean I support low-fat diets? No, I don't. When I'm snacking and mindlessly eating, I don't want to consume energy. It's not a drive to eat that's based on hunger. It's a drive to eat that's based on pleasure and boredom and maybe a little bit of conditioning because I'm sitting down watching TV. And under those circumstances, I don't want energy. I just want my mouth to be happy.
Yeah, it's probably smart.
So I think here's a problem with nutrition. If you tell somebody, if you hear this message as a patient, somebody listening, what diet rule is that? Right? There's no diet rule for that. That's not low carb. Well, it is sort of low carb. I mean, peppers and it's not low fat, So the diet rules can be very tough.
Yeah, it can be very confusing. I think,
and that's a good segue into satiety-per-calorie. So what do you think? What do you think of diet rules being very tough and this nuance that's lost?
Yeah. No. So what I'm fascinated about now is, can we take this new complexity and make it simple again? Because low carb is so simple. You just say, okay, don't eat carbs. What are carbs? Well, they are, these foods, rice and bread and so forth. Don't eat it. Okay, that's very simple and it works. So it has a beauty in that sense, right? You can give a simple piece of advice and it actually is proven to work. That's pretty brilliant. Now, if all these new studies are correct, then low carb is not the only way. You can actually achieve success in many ways. There are multiple probably factors. And the reason why low carb works so well is because it tends to drive you in the right direction on most of these factors on average. But it's not perfect, right? Not everybody succeeds on a low carb or ketogenic diet. And we can get into why that may be. And also, not everybody's happy excluding all carbs forever. So I don't think it's the one and only solution for everybody.
You hit the important question. It's what happens when it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Okay. What is the cause?
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
And then what happens? I think the other thing you mentioned here, all those different populations. I have my notes here. Is hey, wait a second. Anecdotally, historically, anthropologically, there are sects of people who seem to live quite healthy lives with a higher unprocessed carbohydrate diet. So how can we reconcile these two? And I have my thoughts, but I want to hear yours first.
Yeah. I mean, I think it probably comes down to that there isn't just one factor. It's not just about the carbs, right? Low carb works, but that's not the only thing. It's just correlated with a lot of different factors that drive overeating, and what the problem in the ultra processed food environment seems to be again multiple factors. Why the hell is modern ultra processed food, engineered to make us want to overeat it? Sort of, why are all these factors going in the wrong direction? Well, I think it comes down to profit. The food environment, the food industry needs to bring profit to their shareholders. That's what they're here to do, right? And how do you bring profit to your shareholders in the food industry? Well, you sell cheap ingredients for a lot of money and you sell a lot, right?
Well, hold on. So cheap, addictive ingredients, right?
Yeah,
I
mean,
I think addictive is the key word here, because the way that they made me 350 pounds, and I will to this day say I'm a victim of my food environment and my medical environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is they have the information every dieter needs, right? They know how to make food better.
Yeah.
Once you know how to make food better, you know how to claw that back.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I was trying to say that, cheap ingredients that people want to eat a lot of. How do you make people want to eat a lot of it? Well, I mean, addiction is the ultimate level. If you can get people all the way to addiction, you are a success as a food marketer, as a food engineer, as a processed food company. If you can hook people on your product so that they can't stop eating and can't stop buying, well, there's your profit right there. You're going to be rich, right? So that's the goal. How can you engineer cheap ingredients into something that people can't stop eating and can't stop buying? That's the holy grail for the food industry. That's where the maximum profit point is. And cheap ingredients, by the way, tends to be low in nutrition. Fat is cheap, sugar is cheap, starch is cheap.
Hold on. Unsaturated
feed oils are cheap. Yeah, feed oils.
Unsaturated fat is cheap.
Yeah, sure.
Which I want to talk to you about at some point.
Vegetable oils are cheap, right?
Very cheap. Interestingly, there was a study that came out this week. We're going to do a journal club on it tomorrow by John Speakman, Herman Ponzer, who I'm not a fan of Herman Ponzer, but this particular paper was interesting. It looked at over 5 decades the drop in the metabolism of people over 5 decades.
Yeah, I know. Very strange numbers, actually. A little bit hard to
200 to 300 calories
exactly.
a day, right? 200 to 300 calories a day. That metabolism has dropped over the last 5 decades, and they looked to see what was the cause. Was it physical activity? It wasn't. We were exercising more, if anything. And what one of the theories they put in their paper, and John Speakman actually said this, which really made me excited. He goes, he said that it could very well be the decrease in saturated fat in our diet.
Yeah,
and you know what he said?
That's highly speculative, but an interesting speculation.
And he actually in his tweet said it very well could be explained by the carbohydrate insulin model. And I was floored, Andreas, that he wrote that.
No, it's an interesting theory. But there are you can explain that in a million ways. Reduce smoking, reduce infectious disease, like have antibiotics, etc.
I thought that. So he mentions reduce infectious disease in there. Herman Ponzer sort of pontificated on that. But we have more chronic infections now, chronic HIV, chronic, and there's obesity epidemics in HIV, there's obesity epidemics in hepatitis C, and so it and look at throughout the pandemic, I mean, we've had, infection after infection, and yet obesity has gone up. So it struck me that some of the other theories didn't seem to pan out. But
we'll see.
To the point, cheap ingredients. They said that he actually mentioned seed oils in his paper. In the paper, they said that it could very well be that the seed oils and the lack of saturated fat are at play here, which comes back to your point of cheap ingredients.
Yes, cheap, low nutrition ingredients, super highly hyper palatable, processed, highly energy dense. I mean, all of these factors are driving overeating, driving profit, and that's why the food environment looks like it is, because that's where the profit incentive is constantly pulling. And that's why I believe the obesity is bound to get worse and worse and worse until we find some solution, because this is not going to stop. It's just an evolution towards ever more addictive, ever more ultra processed foods. Yeah, maybe we'll all have to be on these GLP-1
Well, it's funny you mentioned that.
drugs.
It's funny you mentioned that the processed oils. So if you eat a diet void of starch, your body will actually release a ton of GLP, endogenous GLP. If you eat and particularly for olive oil and saturated fat, lard, that we've done the feeding studies, we've looked at GLP production. If you add starch to fat, the GLP production goes away. Interestingly, these new oils, the safflower oil, sunflower oil, they do not release GLP. So our modern food environment, combining carbs and processed fat, right, is literally causing a deficiency in this hormone that now we are giving to people.
Yeah, sure, of course.
I find it like the most bizarre sort of like weird profit circle ever. And yet
it is absurd. It is truly atrocious, really, what's happening.
I'm not to say the drugs, I know you and I both recognize these drugs are powerful tools that can be used for good. Not
powerful tool.
Saying that, but it says something about our food environment. So what is the solution against?
Yes. So coming back to the main point, basically, through all this, if there are multiple factors, then unfortunately it becomes very, very challenging for anybody who's not a nutrition PhD, to wade through all this information. And, how are you going to make sense of all these data in your everyday life? It may be just impossible. So what I propose, and what some smart people are sort of coming around to, is, what if we build technological tools to make that simple, take all this complexity and make it simple again, like counting carbs, because counting carbs is simple, but it's not an exact approach. It doesn't take into account these details. What if you can take all these details and then make it simple again, and build simple tools to help people find more satiating foods, foods that they love. That's what we're building now at Diet Doctor, and eventually, we talked about this. Eventually, we plan for this to move away from Diet Doctor and keep Diet Doctor focused on low carb and keto, this proven approach, but take this innovative thing and put it in another place. But I think that's the future, because what it promises is that you can actually build something, for example, to help people who plateau on low carb or keto, who don't reach their goals, or who struggle. This tool could be used for any of those people, and for people who don't feel like being without carbs for the rest of their life is something they want to do. Then it's good to have options for the long term.
I want to talk about 2 points.
Very interesting.
2 points here I want to stay on, because I've written this down twice now. The question you're answering right now, in my mind, is, and I don't want to go into the criticism yet. Maybe we could spend a couple of minutes talking about criticism.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
But let's talk about the reason for it, which is what happens when low carb. So the question you're answering is, what happens when low carb doesn't work? And why, right? That's what you're looking to answer. And the other thing is, what happens when people just don't want to do it? How do we empower those people to find health and metabolic health?
Exactly.
Right. And so that becomes a different question to me than, try this new approach. It's what happens when this doesn't work.
I don't want to replace low carb. Low carb is a proven approach I love it. I mean, I've been on a lower carb diet myself for more than 20 years. I'm
haven't
really
had
the
beans in
biggest
10
fan.
years.
You're going to be
I haven't had
fine.
beans in 10 years, Andreas, you know?
Yeah, you're cool, way cooler than me.
Yeah.
I'm,
When was the
I'm
last
not.
time
I'm
you
not.
had beans? I want to know when you had
I'm not keto low carb anymore. I'm
Yeah.
more like more moderate,
Yeah.
but still eating like a third of what normal people do.
Yeah. So has your diet changed, or do you still relatively eat the same as when you did?
No, I mean it's changed a bit. I have to say, in periods I've been extremely low carb, sub 20 grams of carbs per day, and now I probably average more like 100 or so. So
And
of course it's
does that
changed. It's
include
more,
vegetables, or what is
yeah,
what does that look
everything.
like? You know?
I mean, lots of vegetables, I mean, I do eat a lot of beans and lentils, and I eat a little bit of potatoes. I mean, occasionally I do eat some wheat and stuff like that as well.
Oh, won't tell
But
the
I'm
doctor.
trying to keep it much lower than most people.
Got it. So when did you begin including these things back into your diet? You know, was it more recently, 5 years ago, 10 years ago?
I mean, it's been a process of sort of raising the protein level, and then over time becoming more agnostic about the fat versus carb. I can dial that up or down. If I eat a little bit more carbs, I eat a little bit more moderate in fat, not so high fat. And my take is that as long as your gut can tolerate it and so forth, it's not so critical, right? As long as protein is high and it's unprocessed, yeah, you can raise carbs a bit and keep fats more moderate, and you get virtually the same effect in many ways.
If you're metabolically well, I would say.
Yeah, sure. Sure.
Okay, so it sounds like the questions you're looking to answer is what happens if you don't want to if you want to include carbs, right? Which is that's important. There are people who come to my office and say, I need to figure out a way to, eat beans. You got to make it work. I'm going to have X amount of beans and rice, and this, I know myself. And so people will want to choose a lifestyle that's not low in carbohydrate. And also, there are people who low carbohydrate diets, for whatever reason, a number of reasons, and we've seen them, don't work. I think our answers may differ here. So, what do you think about these things, patient preference, and what happens when low carb isn't enough?
Yeah, I think these are both huge factor, because we're talking about a problem that most of the population has, and I don't think keto is going to solve it for all of them. So we need more tools in the toolbox, I think. Yeah, when it comes to why
Let's start with
low carb
one.
and keto don't work.
Start with choosing, okay, somebody doesn't want to do low carb, right? So they're like, look, I want X, Y, and Z food. What's the solution? What's the solution for them?
It is more foods with a higher satiety-per-calorie is the approach we're taking. It's just an agnostic approach that takes in all these factors that, well, not all factors in the world, but a select few that seems to be driving much of this effect, and together perhaps explain more than looking at only the carbohydrates. So that's in our sense, is in our approach, it's protein percentage, which takes into all the macros, including carbs and fat. And then it's energy density, which is how refined is it, how concentrated is the energy. And then it's fiber, which tends to, in a higher carb setting at least, slow down absorption of the nutrients and give more satiety. And then it's this
carb fat
hedonic factor, the highly rewarding foods, the sugar and fat together. But actually we're making it more advanced now, because there are other evidence-based, exactly, salt together with carbohydrates, salt together with fat, like salted nuts. This also tends to drive up the hedonic, the reward factor. So we're incorporating all these, a multitude of these combinations now. So it becomes really interesting. And what we do then is we have this big giant algorithm that we try to train on all the available data and studies to weigh these factors together and make it into one number, one scale, where we can rank foods from the most satiating to the least satiating on the scale. And then you could try to guide people to higher, more satiating foods. So all this sounds very complex, but the complexity is in the background. So we try to take all this complexity and make it as simple as possible again to guide people. Just one scale, more or less satiating per calorie. And
Do you think simplicity? Do you think the simplicity? So some may argue that the simplicity is potential for harm. Not that it's harm.
Sure. I mean, it's not going to be 100% exact, but neither is counting carbs, right? You're missing a lot, or counting fat, or looking at only. And I mean, all dietary approaches that I'm aware of, they all have their flaws and problems, right? And arguably, what we're doing with our approach, which has multiple factors in it, is actually more robust than most of these other things, because it takes in more information. So we can argue about that.
I'd come back to sort of observational retrospective data versus interventional data. So when we use drugs, for example, right? We'll come back to our first question: how do these work, right? How do these interventions work? Low fat, how does it work? What is the way it's working, right? Same questions we ask when we use a drug, right? And then so what is the mechanism, right? And then the next part is how has it performed in interventional trials, right? How is this intervention? How has calorie counting performed versus low-fat diets? Calorie counting has performed worse, by the way, than low-fat diets. Weight Watchers, the point system counting has worked worse than low-fat diets. Like ad-lib low-fat, right? Like just go eat low-fat, right? So just this messaging, coming back to simple messaging, the point systems have not really done very well. And then, if you compare diet to diet, I'd say there's a squeak, a hair better for low carb diets in general. So as just a approach, right? And a simple approach that you give somebody, low carb to me sounds like a easier, simpler thing to say than follow this satiety per calorie, which is sort of like looking at all the data and then working backwards, right? Rather than
I would agree with you. I would agree with you that it is simpler to explain, perhaps far simpler actually. It's just don't eat carbs. You can see it on the nutrition panel, the carbs, right? You can Google it. It's very easy. So the problem with our satiety approach today is there is no fantastic tool to make it simple. And without a simple tool, it is not simple to do. Yeah. So that's what we're building, but it's not done yet. So
it's like an ambitious, longer term project. So it sounds like this is an ambitious sort of long-term project, which gets me excited.
Yeah, definitely. But today low carb is simpler, no doubt, hands down.
So how help me understand, and maybe without getting into, I'm not looking for your intellectual property. How do you plan to take this concept and evolve it? How do you plan to take this concept because right now, the way I view it is, okay, you, Ted, your team, brilliant people. I mean, I know, dietitians on your team. Certainly Brett was there. I mean, you have some of the most brilliant minds right there with
some fantastic people. I mean,
Adele
your team
was working with you.
It was amazing, but yeah, I've been blessed to work with some super smart people.
These are like really, really smart people, but I have to sort of, and I've told you, I've listened to the criticism of Nick Norwitz, who talked to Ted on a I forget which podcast, and I felt like his concerns. He's like a sort of a fresh face, brilliant sort of scientific thinker, and all of his criticism, I found myself nodding, but I'm not sure Ted, was able to even express sort of what is the plan for this. And so, maybe you could just help answer that question for me, because I want to understand sort of what is the plan for this. I'm interested by it. I'm somewhat skeptical. I'm somewhat like, wow, like, how do you position this to something that works? And so what is the plan to evolve it? Because right now it's a look back. It's like, here's all the trial data. Let's see how it did, right? And how do you go forward, or do you go forward?
For sure.
What's the plan to develop the evidence base around this?
Yeah. The goal, I mean, this is super interesting topic and big. So I'm just thinking about where to start here. First of all, I would say value feedback. Negative feedback is perhaps the most valuable. I think Nick and other people have provided some quality feedback that is helpful for us as we evolve this. And as when you create something new into the world, then I think it's natural that people criticize it and kick the tires of it and say, hey, this is new, it's unfamiliar, I don't like it. Here's why I don't like it. What do you say? So I think that's all fair and good. I have a list of some of the things that Nick and other people have brought up, and I think that the main thing is, how do you validate this? Where is the evidence that this scoring system actually predicts outcomes? And what I would say there is that all the components of the score, I would argue, are pretty well validated in randomized controlled trials. It's not super controversial to say that protein is a satiating macronutrient, or that less processed, less energy dense foods tend to lead to eating less, or that at least in a carb eating context, fiber tends to slow down absorption and be more satiating. I mean, many studies showing that, and is that hyperpalatable addictive foods drive overeating. There is also plenty of research to support that notion. So what our scoring system does is it pulls in that direction on all of these factors. So
I mean, I get it. You're like,
each of those works, right?
I like that mechanism. I like that mechanism. I like that mechanism.
Yeah.
I want to somehow add this to a repertoire. I mean, I understand, and it makes sense pragmatically.
Yeah, exactly. But pragmatically, exactly. So,
but like, that's different than an intervention.
So here, yeah, I agree. But I think it's just, this is the innovation, right? All of these on their own, they work, but they're very complex to do together. Like, you choose one, you pick one and do one, right? What our approach allows you to do is to leverage all of them together. And then you could think, well, maybe that doesn't work. Maybe each of them work, but if you do them together, somehow it didn't work. That is possible, but seems implausible. And when we actually test this, when people use this approach, we have high satiety meal plans, etc., and we have done internal pilot studies, etc. They get good results. The people who have struggled, for example, on keto, can break through plateaus. People who have been missing carbs and now they're eating a little bit more carbs, they can get equal or better results in many cases. So it actually, when we test it on actual people, it seems to have exactly the effect that you would expect. I mean, an analogy I like to use is to think, well, we know that sleeping is good for health. We know that exercise is good for health. We know that not smoking is good for health. And we know that eating a nutritious diet is generally good for health. Okay. What if you do all of them? Is there randomized controlled trials to prove that these work together, or that, this is more important than this one, or by X%? No, there is no randomized trial to prove that. but yet we assume that doing all of them is good. It's better than just choosing one. Like if you sleep well and exercise, it tends to be probably better than just picking one, right? If you also quit smoking, it's even better. We assume this, right?
Yeah,
Would you agree?
I get what you're saying. It's like not everything needs a trial. We're just combining things that we know are good.
Exactly.
You know,
And then the objection is, but how are you combining it? How do you know that it's combined in the exact right way? And there the answer is there is no knowledge available today to say exactly how these factors combine. It doesn't exist in the world. Do we need more research? Yes, absolutely. And we are looking very closely at all the research taking place. Like, for example, Kevin Hall is doing a very interesting study that's just very related to this now, and I'm just eagerly awaiting the results. But I don't think the lack of perfect knowledge means we can't do something. Just like the lack of perfect knowledge of how sleep interacts with exercise, etc., doesn't mean that we can't start sleeping better or exercising more. We can do it today with the evidence we have, and then when we get more evidence, we can improve. That's how I see it.
I understand. I wonder. I wonder if there's a way to sort of demonstrate the value in real time. You know, I often wonder the power of user-generated data.
Yes, absolutely, exactly.
In sort of weight loss, right? Because you know, it's interesting. Right now, you know, we're doing a review of charts. You know, 500 patients or so, right? And we have a data set that doesn't exist in the literature right now. Isn't that crazy? That
That's great.
a social media punk, you know, podcast, you know, jerk, you know, weight loss, diet industry agitator, right? That I have a data set that doesn't exist in the medical literature. And it hit me, how embarrassing is that for our profession?
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right.
I'm not bringing myself up, you know, because I think as I said, I'm a social media agitator, and I'm first and foremost. What I'm saying is how embarrassing is it for our colleagues that I am bringing a data set. So it makes me think, how do we raise our bar? Because when I listen to Nick Norwitz, what I'm hearing from his criticism is not how to bring down SPC. What I'm hearing is these are the things we need to do to raise the bar.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Let's aim to get more knowledge, get more research. I mean, another thing that Nick brings up is we shouldn't give people a simple tool like this. We should instead educate them about all the intricacies of food and all the factors.
Which diet doctor did so well.
I think. Can I
just say something? Which diet doctor did so well. They gave.
Thank you.
You know,
Thank you, Tro.
What diet doctor did so well is make it easy, one, right? But they also gave like more. Hey, if you know what to eat, but you're just not doing it, here's food addiction. You know, here's an up-to-date understanding of the data as it comes out, you know, and what it gave you in terms of the images are just beautiful. The recipes are so easy. The images for, you know, and you were gracious enough to say that, you know, we can, you know, use those images, right? So in our patient education, you know, those images of carbs and which foods have more and less, you could look at this and you knew exactly what to do, right? You knew exactly what to do, right? And for your intended goal of lowering your carbohydrates, right? And for somebody with diabetes and metabolic syndrome, it was And it still is, in my opinion, one of the best sort of entry points.
Oh, thank you.
What I'd love to see is, you're trying to answer the questions, what happens if it doesn't work? And what happens if you don't want to do it? That's the questions I feel like you're trying to answer. And in my mind, it's, okay, it's very difficult to live without carbs, or maybe you want to include X, Y, and Z. How do you do it and achieve your goals? Fine. I can see SPC sort of working there, right? But then there's this huge gap, which I think is the majority of people, which is a bigger problem, right? It's not the gym people who want to have some beans and who really need the help, right? Or or who have cultural sensitivities and just, want to include certain foods and not others. I personally don't think that that's the majority problem. I personally think the majority problem is what happens, right, when it doesn't work. When I know what I'm supposed to eat, and I know I'm eating too much cheese or nuts or whatever it is, when I know I have these principles of information, these nuggets, that the salt on the macadamia nuts are driving me to eat more, that the dairy fat just makes me more hungry, right? And I'm still not doing the things that I know. And this goes into the realm of food addiction, right? Or addictive eating. And so I wonder, do you think that who is SPC for? Is it for people who are not want to include food and maybe they're not getting enough protein, and that's why they're having some stalling of their weight, or maybe they're eating sort of addictive foods like dairy and nuts, or and what about the people who know what they're supposed to eat and don't do it? It's a tough one.
Big question. I think it can be a helpful tool for a lot of different things that you mentioned. For example, if people struggle on low carb and they don't know why, I think that the SPC model, the satiety model, is potentially very helpful, because actually the foods that are commonly known to be a problem on low carb, you mentioned some dairy fat, salted roasted nuts, etc. They tend to be the lowest satiety foods of all common low carb foods. So I find it super interesting, right, that there hasn't been a sort of carb insulin model based explanation for why are these foods actually the problematic ones in a general low carb diet. But when you look at it from an SPC angle, from the satiety angle, then those are the lowest satiety.
I'm going to help you out with
I know. There are plenty of explanations.
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Fine. Maybe they are.
Yeah.
Maybe they are. But it's still a fascinating coincidence that when you run these through our satiety algorithm, they end up at the lowest end of all the low carb foods, exactly the foods that you're talking about here. And cheese tends to be a little bit lowish as well, but perhaps less so.
Well, so, but here's the fascinating. I'm gonna pause right here, because cheese and nuts are very high in fat. They have certain qualities that make them just very difficult to limit. Right?
Exactly.
But
I mean, that's okay.
But nobody binges on a stick of butter. Just takes a butter and eats it. Nobody. I mean, very few. No. Nobody drinks olive oil, which are also very low satiety and very low, quote unquote, low satiety per calorie, and very high in fat. So nobody's binging on olive oil. So
absolutely. I mean, 100% agree. Here's the thing, Tro. These are different mechanisms, right?
Yeah.
Some of them are in the hedonic realm, the combinations of carbs and fat together, or fat and salt together in salted nuts, right? Other are in the very highly energy dense and low protein and low fiber, of course. Take oil.
So take my olive oil, and I'm going to add salt to it. Okay, it's very low energy density, very high fat, right? Okay, and
it's super high,
very low protein.
Yeah. Yes,
but I can't overeat that.
Well, on its own, but you add it to.
Oh, if I add it to vegetables, if I add it to carbs, I'm done.
But here's the thing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm not against olive oil. I think olive oil is great. I use it myself, right? I'm not a not on a crusade against olive oil.
I'm not either. I'm just trying to figure out truth. So
yeah, I just don't think drinking olive oil on its own is a great thing for weight loss. If you add it on top of a satiating, nourishing, protein-rich meal in modest amounts, I think it's fantastic. You do always need some energy, right? You're not going to live on protein alone. You can't just live on broccoli and chicken breast unless you're a masochist, right? That's going to be miserable. You need some fat.
Well, I just think to myself that I think there's something special at the extremes. I think there's something special in terms of satiety that happens at the extremes.
Yeah, there is. And I think one of the factors that happens at the extremes is that the hedonic factor drops to zero. Like you said, nobody is interested in drinking a full bottle of olive oil or a whole stick of butter. Nobody
or a baked potato, plain baked potato.
Exactly, plain baked potato with nothing on it, right?
Plain tuna,
Plain, yes.
Nobody wants
exactly. The attractive things are the combinations of carbs and fats together. So I think that's absolutely true, and that I think is the main explanation for why the extremes tend to be more effective, because you exclude all of those combinations, right?
So should we be driving people into the extremes when the mantra has been everything in moderation?
Yes, I think everything in moderation is a terrible piece of advice, by the way.
Yeah. I wonder, I think that, just to pontificate, I think, as a addition to, sort of the low carb space, I don't see necessarily a SPC serving a great tool, but I certainly see it as like a potential tool for people who want to include carbohydrates, or who want to include, foods that are, junky, right? And it's like, okay, what is the best version of this junky food that I can?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what we can do. Some very interesting things we can do. We can rank foods in different food groups. And if you're you want to eat a hamburger at a hamburger place, it's not going to be the best food in the world. You know it, but you're going to go there anyway because your friends are going there. Whatever, I don't know. We can guide you to better versions of that are more consistent with your goals. For example, the sugary soda. You can rank all these foods. You can see that the sugary soda is probably the worst thing in that place. And then you can debate: should you drink water or should you drink a diet soda? Well, that debate will go ever on, but water. At least stay away. Water is probably the best and safest, sure, but stay away from the sugar, right? And then you look at what's the next worst thing. Well, probably it's the French fries. At least if you look at the SPC, of course they're awful from a carb perspective too. But they're like combinations of carbs and fat together, very addictive in nature and salted as well, right? And no nutrition whatsoever. So next thing is, okay, stay away from that, or at least keep it to a minimum. What about the burger then? Well, the burger tends to be the least bad thing in that place. And you could do things to make it even better. You could add a second or a third patty. You could potentially remove the bread if you really want to go super low carb. But just adding more patties and having a bigger burger with a non-sugar drink, now you're in a completely different place than if you just buy the cheapest, biggest option with sugar drink, lots of French fries, and a tiny burger.
So now you're in my wheelhouse.
Right?
Now you're in my wheelhouse.
You moved to a better place.
What you've described here, and this is literally probably what we do every day for the last 5 years, probably why we get the results we get. If you looked, you took your approach and you embodied a behavioral approach. You said, here's the food you want, here's the places you're going to eat, and we're going to help you make better decisions. It's not a nutrition approach. It's not. Right? You took this is the food you said, I'm going to respect your desires for food, and I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you at the locations that you're already going to.
Yeah.
right? And I'm going to cater to your preferences. Do you want a sweet drink or not? Right? This is what you did. And this is, again, coming back to, what happens when low carb doesn't work. I suspect what went into the idea of SPC is how do we address these people? And maybe it's about food. What if it's about behavior? Right? What if it's about behavior? And maybe we'll leave it here and we'll do a part 2 one day, because it's been 90
That would be
minutes,
fun. It would be fun.
But I have to say, I'm excited as a middle child, which I am. I as an entrepreneur and somebody who I feel like there's very few physician entrepreneurs in the metabolic health space, so I've always viewed it as a sort
it's you and me, Tro.
No, I've always viewed you as a sort of,
there are
and I've asked you, hey, can we get you an SMHP? Can we get you to be a mentor to some of these doctors, or at least talk about physician entrepreneurship? Because we're not, there's not many of us. I'm excited. So from that side, for SPC, for your new company, which I know you can't talk about the name yet, where SPC will live, I'm excited for that. Then there's a part of me as a middle child, all the researchers, that Adrian Sotomoda and Nick Norwitz, and some people who have criticized sort of the scientific basis of what they believe you're proposing. I see their points, I respect their points, so I feel like a little bit of a middle child. Nonetheless, I'm excited to see what happens. I'm excited.
And again, I think scientific criticism is vital, right? And new things should be thoroughly vetted. So I think there's a lot left to do, and a lot of criticism left to come, and I think that's good. I still believe that, we've vetted this against some really smart people around the world. I think something like this may just be an important part of the future. I think low carb will always be part of the future too, but I think we need, like you just said, for some people, it may not be everything they need. We need more tools in the toolbox. And it's just very exciting to me to see, can we use all this research and all this information and take all this complexity and somehow still make it simple and useful for people. I think something like that is the future. I'm just excited to be part of exploring what that could mean.
Dr. Andreas Eenfeldt, thanks for coming, and visit, if you haven't already, I'm sure every single one of our listeners have visited dietdoctor.com, and you can follow Dr. Andreas Eenfeldt on Twitter, and certainly Diet Doctor on all platforms. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot, Tro. Pleasure to be on.